Americans. Have you ever experienced a culture shock in your own country? Story 1. Of course, the country is so large. For example, I went to Texas and was shocked how proud Texas is of being Texas. At my hotel the waffles were Texas-shaped. I went to order coffee and the sizes were small, medium, and Texas. Story 2. Heck, I had culture shock in my own county. I live in WV along the border with Ohio, and the northern end of our county has bridges that connect us to Ohio, whereas the southern end is more isolated. Fresh out of college, my first teaching job was as a long-term substitute at a small high school in the southern end of the county. On the first day, students said stuff like, "You have a weird accent. Are you British or something? Where are you from?" Me, about an hour north of here. Story 3. Had to go to the Native American reservations before. Was honestly shocked at the level of poverty I saw. I've been to some third world countries and didn't think that level of existence was possible in the US. Story 4. I'm from the Northeast, and I traveled down alone to the South for the first time last summer. When I got out of the train and was waiting for my Uber, some random guy came along and started having a conversation with me. At first I thought he wanted something from me, then I just started getting confused, then uncomfortable. I'm just so bewildered by people just being open to talking for minutes at a time to a stranger. Wild. Story 5. I don't know if this counts, but one time a white girl went to an all-black church sermon with my friend. It was incredibly different from what I was used to, and a little overwhelming. It was very loud and there was dancing. It was like a party, especially compared to the relatively somber sermons that I was used to, where the most dancing was swaying in place and clapping to the beat. Story 6. New York City. If you come in from JFK Airport, it's almost impossible to tell the size of the buildings. It's unbelievable how massive everything is. Once you get into the city though, Brooklyn is surprisingly quiet and friendly. Even Manhattan isn't all that different if you walk fast and get out of the way on the sidewalk. Story 7. Live in a big East Coast city and went to a small Midwest town college. I couldn't understand why strangers would wave and say hello as I walked by. Actually had to have my roommate explain it to me. Story 8. I've been surprised to find out that some things I thought were common everywhere are really just a southern thing. For example, pimento cheese and homecoming mums. Story 9. The first time I stepped into a really bad neighborhood in my city, I honest to God thought the place looked like a war zone. It was amazing to see how seedy it was. Feces on the ground, bus shelters smelling like urine, boarded up houses. Story 10. I live in Japan, but when I go back to the US, I'm completely shocked about how many choices there are for the smallest things, especially food. What kind of bread do you want for your sandwich? What kind of dressing do you want? What kind of meat do you want? What kind of cheese, toppings, what vegetables? How do you want the bread cut? Toasted? How about sides? Story 11. When I was a teen, my family moved from a town of 8,000 in western North Carolina to the Phoenix metro, about 3,500,000 people. Every part of everything was different. My hometown was roughly 7,030 white black, versus 50 white Latino other. There were no trees, no mountains, no hills, no greenery to speak of. No one talks to you out there. There's no neighborliness. When we got a new home in NC prior to this move, old ladies from the far side of the neighborhood showed up on the doorstep with fresh pound cake and sourdough to welcome us. When we moved into a decently middle-class neighborhood in Phoenix, we lived there for 2 years without ever learning our next-door neighbors' names, or even seeing their faces. I grew up in a town where people left the cars and even their homes unlocked at night, and sometimes even during the day when they left to go grocery shopping. We were in Phoenix for only a few months before someone smashed my dad's car window to steal the factory radio, and it was the strangest realization for me that someone would do that. The things I missed the most were mom-pop diners, home cooking restaurants, etc., places you could walk into early in the morning or on Saturdays, and just order biscuits and eggs and coffee, and just hang out and chat an hour with the other regulars locals to get the news and goings-on. I got made fun of for my accent for the entire time, until I was able to drop it and adopt the clean Midwest speech. When people met me for the first time, they would immediately ask, "Where are you from? Alabama, West Virginia? Is your brother your cousin or something?" I'd never met someone who spoke another language, and bilingual people were suddenly all around me, as well as the multiculturalism. Signs everywhere were in 2 languages, and restaurants offered enchiladas alongside burgers and fries. The bigotry and hypocrisy was eye-opening. One day, my friends at school discovered I'd never heard a Mexican joke, and you'd thought they were competing to see who could tell me the most racist jokes. Teenage me was definitely chuckling a little, but also perplexed at the openly accepted bigotry in the South. If you heard these jokes, it would be back behind the barn, with an understanding that what you were saying hearing wasn't to be repeated among company. So me, trying to fit in, asked this group whether they'd heard this or that black joke. Of course not. They laughed at the first one or two, but then their demeanor gradually changed from amusement to shock. One guy says, "Oh my God, those are horrible," and I'm like, "These are exactly like the ones you're telling about Mexicans." I definitely had a bit of an awakening that day, and I would like to think I helped others too as well. When I moved up north from the deep south as a child, I was shocked to learn that not everyone went to church, and a while ago when I was traveling, I drove through a very rural poor area and was shocked to see billboards advertising government assistance, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid. Story 12. Moved from NJ to GA1, attended an event at the Georgia Dome RIP, and people would zipper out of the parking lot like civilized nice individuals. I'm used to staying as close to the bumper in front of you and not letting anyone, Not even the Pope himself threw two, trying boiled peanuts outside Turnerfield RIP. It was a completely new experience, not bad to be honest, but different. 3. Casual racism. I managed a hotel and guests would be chatting up with me and drop derogatory terms super casually. For on that note, in-your-face racism, I was at the office when our front desk clerk says someone wants to talk to me. So I go to the lobby and a woman tells me she was going to stay at the hotel but now won't because she saw that we hire Mexicans. I told her they're Guatemalan and she can take her business elsewhere. 5. Casual conversations with girls at bars is a thing. In the Northeast, there's an unwritten rule that if someone reciprocates conversation they're into you. I'd be minding my own business and random Southern belles would strike up a conversation with no intention of it being anything other than just a conversation. You ask a girl in NYC something as casual as if she recommends a drink in particular and she'll likely tell you no thanks has happened to me. There was also that one time a girl came up to me and asked me if I wanted to do a round of Osama bin Laden's with her. C.36. I was loading some boxes onto my car and a random pickup pulled over, and the man insisted on helping me even though I repeatedly told him I didn't need help. 7. One day my neighbor casually knocked on my door and gifted me some fresh hunted venison meat, thanks. Story 13. I was raised Mormon and grew up mostly in Utah. I was shocked at how most of the rest of the US, contrary to what I was told as a child, is not only pretty much the same, but often much better. In the Mormon Church you are largely raised to believe that non-Mormons are always struggling due to a lack of blessings, and rape, murder, and theft are rampant in all the other big cities. So glad I left. Story 14. I just moved back to the Southwest after over a decade in various cities. So many things differ by region. Football really is a religion in Texas, Portland. Oregon really is as liberal and crunchy as you're picturing it, and people move there for that mindset, and it builds on itself. So much Jesus in the Southwest, but Hispanic Catholics are different than Southern Baptists. I spent a Christmas in Wisconsin, and it's a magical, frigid, snowy wonderland. The East Coast moves so fast and people are always dressed up. The food, weather, climate, people, traffic, vibes, prices, taxes vary so much in the US. It's great to see the differences all under one proverbial roof. Story 15. I live in South Florida and I see other people experience culture shock all of the time. People visiting from other states are amazed at how Spanish is the primary language in and around Miami. Story 16. As a Southerner, the first time I saw a pride parade in Seattle after the Supreme Court ruling. First it was just me and a couple other carpenters. Then suddenly, penis and dresses and leather and lace. Note I fully supportive of LGBTQ rights, just not accustomed to that sort of display down this way. Story 17. I grew up on a poor rural dairy farm in an area with pretty lacking schools. For grad school I went to a very prestigious university with a lot of international students. I was chatting with a girl from Taiwan a few weeks before graduation about our plans for afterwards, and in the same tone I might mention asking my dad to pick up some pizza for me. She said she was about to ask her dad to buy a defense company so she could get a job in the industry despite not having US citizenship. Story 18. Culture shock in my hometown. I visited the migrant workers neighborhood right in the county that I grew up in. That level of poverty was a bit shocking. There was no electricity or running water, and the houses were just shacks with holes in the walls. Story 19. It's wild going from Michigan to the South. Restaurants, retail and department stores, grocery stores and everything else is done at a much slower pace. Story 20. Met some people from GA during a wedding. Sunday came and they asked what church I'd be going to and if they could tag along. They looked at me like I had an arm growing out of my forehead when I said I didn't go to one. Story 21. My wife's a teacher and I work with a bunch of other nerds in engineering at a different company, so it was pretty wild to see coworkers sitting at a bar together at like 4 p.m. just shit-faced talking on each other, the boss, and a few head kids they've had in the past. I've just never been in an adult workplace where people actually hang out after work and genuinely like each other. Story 22. So, I'm a white woman, and have lived in the Midwest and South for a long time, but primarily in suburban areas. I grew up in the Deep South, so I thought I was fairly progressively minded when it comes to race relations in the US. A while back I moved to the Atlanta area and my husband and I settled on the south end of the metro area. I hadn't found a job yet, so I decided to visit a regional mall in Morrow. I went in and it was fine, but after a few minutes I got this crazy feeling, like my brain was alerting me. It took me a while to realize what it was. I was literally the only white woman in the whole building. There were a lot of people, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, no other whites like me. None of the other shoppers paid me any mind, so I kept shopping, but I kept asking myself, why am I feeling so weird? Everyone's being courteous, or at least not caring if I'm there or not. Then it hit me, this is how my ethnic friends must feel when they're at work or in a situation where they're the only people of color around. Not necessarily bad or scared, but there's definitely a feeling that you're different, and it really does affect one's mood and instincts. I now remember that feeling when I'm at work or in a situation where everyone's mostly white except for one or a few people of color. Are they feeling that way now, even though they're smiling and seeming fine? It certainly helps me understand my own privilege in these sorts of groups. Story 23. Before I moved to the Northeast and was still in school, I had a college professor from New Jersey talk about how shocked his wife was that strangers greet each other. They were driving slowly down a country lane in Kansas and a farmer waved to them from his tractor. The wife asked if the husband knew the man and he laughed. Had been living in Kansas a year before the wife came to join him. I grew up in Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I thought it just natural when you make eye contact with a stranger to smile and nod your head in passing. Maybe you even say a friendly hello or good morning. But I was shocked at how unfriendly life felt once in New York. And when the Northeasterner says hello, it's always how are you followed by a fine how are you doing. There's very few who have a different greeting. I've even had them say thank you when I've greeted a stranger with a good morning, which strikes me the oddest of all possible responses. Typically the stranger's response is ignoring you, or they will correct your good morning evening with the actual time if you get it wrong. Do I miss a simple smile as strangers pass? Moving from Sacramento, California, where we knew all our neighbors, roamed for miles as a child, and regularly got together for block parties, to Fredericksburg, Virginia, where we didn't see, talk to, or spend time with our neighbors, except the few kids I shared a school bus stop with. Story 24. My first real sense of culture shock was when I went to college and realized we didn't get the Monday after Thanksgiving off. Where I'm from, hunting season is a holiday. Story 25. Yes, I'm from southern New Jersey, about a half hour from Philly, so that's my big city of choice. My aunt and I went on vacation to San Francisco, Oregon about 5 years ago, and I was shocked at how slow people function on the West Coast. We visited a state park and the cashier had a 5-minute conversation with everyone in line. It drove me absolutely insane. The East Coast people are always in a rush stereotype is definitely true in my case. I don't think I could ever live on the opposite side of the country for that reason alone. Story 26. So in Maryland, not sure where else has it, but I'm sure other states have it as well, we have Old Bay. Old Bay is a seasoning that's got some kick to it, and it's usually put on crabs, shrimp. Actually, come to think of it, it's put on a ton of. Anyways, I go down to South Carolina with my family and I ask for some Old Bay, and nobody knows what I'm talking about. It's like I was speaking German or something. Nobody had a clue what Old Bay was. Guess they just don't have it in South Carolina. Story 27. It wasn't much of a big deal, but I did once. I've lived my entire life in Kansas, where it's flat and there's very few trees. I mean, we have trees, but like in small clumps here and there. One summer I worked as a camp counselor in Michigan, so I lived up there for 12 months. There were trees everywhere, lining the roads, absolutely everywhere. It was sort of freaky, but very beautiful. I got to see Lake Michigan, which might as well have been an ocean. It was so vast and pretty. Story 28. Yes, in South Carolina I met a biologist who didn't believe in evolution and talked about how badly he wanted to bitches and then got mad at us for making jokes about women who tried to cut in front of us in line for a club because it was disrespectful. Story 29. Visiting Alabama. Every once in a while you'd hear a voice call in on the radio, or at a convenience store, that was near indecipherable. I think I've been exposed to a wide variety of accents, lived in England, the Northeast, the Midwest, been good friends with my Chinese immigrant neighbors, but this was so slurred I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Visiting distant family in a small northern Missouri, southern Iowa town barely more than a hamlet, they technically had a church. I was surprised how everything felt like an episode of Twin Peaks, with their town so focused on high school football and every appliance looking like it was from the 70s, almost no people between the age of 18 and 50, with the exception of a disgruntled general store employee, made the 90s Fargo movie look like Southern California. Story 30. This user has edited all their comments and posts in response to Reddit's changes to their API policy. This user has deleted their account in protest to Reddit and their changes to their API policy. This user has edited all their comments and posts in response to Reddit's changes to their API policy. This user has deleted their account in protest to Reddit and their changes to their API policy. This user has edited all their comments and posts in response to Reddit's changes to their API policy. This user has deleted their account in protest to Reddit and their changes to their API policy. Story 31. I live in the Midwest and it's always a culture shock going to the West Coast for vacation. Midwest is kinda slow-paced, traditional, homey. West Coast is fast-paced, trendy, modern. I always leave the West Coast feeling extremely average in every way possible, out of date, and ugly. I can't imagine how people live there longer than a week, because that would cause me serious mental problems, especially LA. That place is toxic. Story 32. Yes, I attended a small private middle school about 100 which was 99 white, and then went to a 3,000 student high school that was 99 black. For the first couple of months of high school, I literally could not understand what my classmates were saying. How things were pronounced, the slang they used. They might as well have spoken a different language to me. It was so strange to not be able to communicate with people speaking in my own language. Eventually, I caught on though. Story 33. On the Jersey Turnpike a few years ago, I stopped at a rest stop to use the bathroom and get some food. Of the 30 people in the rest stop, probably 25 of them were black. I'm from New England. Even the few parts here that are mostly non-white aren't that non-white, and there's a lot of Latino and Portuguese people in the mix. My hometown of 40,000 was 80 white, and my current town of 20,000 is 95 white. There was just all black people, myself and 3 or 4 other white people. Same in Nashville earlier this year when I walked to Walgreens. I was the only white dude in a store that was fairly busy. It kinda feels like a Twilight Zone episode. Story 34. I had no idea you could go to a store like Walmart for liquor in many states, until I went to Mardi Gras in New Orleans in 2005. Can't do that in PA. I was verily gobsmacked. Story 35. I was born in Pennsylvania and moved to Massachusetts. The biggest culture shock I experienced was the relationship between car traffic behavior and pedestrian behavior. In my hometown, the road rules are strictly enforced and people generally drive in a pretty safe manner. Pedestrians hardly ever jaywalk except for in places where you have no choice, suburbs without sidewalks and the like. When I moved to Massachusetts, I noticed that people drive really aggressively. They break the rules of the road pretty frequently, like really frequently. Cars will never give each other their rightful right of way. They'll never yield to pedestrians unless those pedestrians play chicken with them. Then there's the pedestrians. The pedestrians are fucking insane. They'll just run right into the middle of flowing traffic and act like the drivers are the assholes when they honk their horns. It's like they have a fucking death wish. Story 36. Visiting San Francisco for the first time after living in the South all my life. I've been to large cities, of course, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, etc., but I've never seen such an open display of complete poverty in the middle of so much wealth, nor did I expect the amount of people who acted like it wasn't even there. Including my friend who I was there visiting. When I brought it up, she was just kind of like, oh yeah, it's horrible, they're everywhere, hey there's this cafe I want to show you. It not only changed the way I thought of as the progressive West Coast, it shined a light on my friend that I never expected to see. Story 37. I'm in Hampton Roads area of Virginia and went to visit my dad's family in the Niagara area of New York. They have a huge wire tower thing in their backyard and it felt very industrial suburban, if that makes sense. I was in cultural shock when I arrived since it was so different from where I live. I just found out last week that they live right near Love Canal and where the Manhattan Project waste was disposed. So yeah, big culture shock. Story 38. I went through terrible culture shock. I'm a black male and spent the initial portion of my childhood growing up in Hawaii. I was always the only black child in school, and dealt with a lot of racism coming up. It got to the point that my life was being threatened in my first week of high school from a Samoan bully that always pulled guns on me. At this point I made a cry to my mother to move away from Hawaii, and moved to Los Angeles with my father. Parents have been separated since birth. I abandoned the first semester of high school and moved in with my father in South Central Los Angeles. Lo and behold, I get enrolled to Crenshaw High School where the population was about 98 black. Growing up in Hawaii made me an extreme outsider. I had a laid-back lifestyle and wore short and flip-flops to school. What a mistake. I've never felt more awkward being around 2,500 black students who looked at me like I was an alien. I got teased and laughed the whole first day of class. On the walk home from school I was held at gunpoint and had my lunch money stolen and was threatened to never walk down that street again. A 12-mile walk home turned into a 45-minute detour. Countless run-ins with gangbangers and thugs that wanted to extort everything from me all the time. For the first time in my life, I'm admitting to Reddit of all places that I was extremely suicidal at this point in my life. I didn't know who to associate with or how. I created a fake persona just to be accepted by others, which in the long run kept me from ever getting to know who I really am as a person. But 20 years later, I'm glad to know that I was able to rebuild myself and my identity, and I truly enjoy who I am as a person. Best of all, I am able to fully embrace the black culture without feeling jaded by it. For so long I felt like I was an imposter trying to fit into a culture that rejected me because I was black, but not black. Story 39. When I was pretty young, our family would sometimes give my sister's friend a ride to school or other places. Her parents were from the Middle East somewhere, and their language was Urdu, but the daughter-sister's friend spoke English. Anyway, they invited my sister and me inside their house one time and the shock I got was the smell. It was not a bad smell per se, it was like an herb spice smell but super powerful, and they had what I imagine was garlic cloves or something similar sitting on the coffee table. Not sure if that was the source of the smell or not. Anyways, it was not a gross smell, but it was so heavy and powerful that it was unpleasant to me. My sister told me the smell is intentional and that it smells good to them. We were both kids, so that could have been bullshit. Anyways, I was too afraid to be rude and ask if everyone from their old country used the spice smell in their house or just them. Like, is it a cultural thing or was my bland nose too sensitive or what? I still wonder about it sometimes. Story 40. I grew up mostly in Hawaii, so I've had some odd culture shocks adjusting to mainland life. Some small, some big different kinds of white people. In HI, white is haole and that's about that. It wasn't until I was in the military that I saw how much pride some people put into being Irish, Italian, Scandinavian, etc. Little having a big old bowl of beef stew or chili without serving it on rice. Blew my mind and still can't do it. Always make rice with either at home. Story 41. Mormon culture in Idaho. Moved from Wisconsin to southern Idaho for PA school. Absolutely loved the mountains, nature, etc. I'm an active Lutheran, but the way Mormons live is different from any other Christians I've been around. The sense of community is really tight. I was invited to family home evening more than once and enjoyed it a lot. From my experience, Mormons are probably the best neighbors you could ask for. Helpful, friendly, quiet, don't drink or smoke. The faith itself can be pretty goofy from my theological POV. Guess you can say the stuff I believe is also pretty weird from a non-religious perspective though. Dating was odd. Might involve being asked to go to church together. Casual drinks or coffee are both non-starters. Getting married very quickly is also the norm. Story 42. No, I've always been pretty comfortable in most environments. I grew up in a city in NC with a father from New York and a mother from the mountains of Tennessee, regularly interacted with people from a variety of foreign and local cultures. I think the closest thing I had to a culture shock was going over to the home of a couple who were friends of mine for the first time. I knew they were into bondage, fetish photography, and had a dom-sub relationship and none of that bothered me. but they had a variety of toys scattered about their house and a suspension rack in one of their rooms. It was the first-hand experience I had with that subculture aha in a lived-in environment, and it was unusual, but it didn't really change anything for me or alter how I interacted with them. Story 43. Moving from Portland, Oregon to San Diego, California kind of blew me away. If you are unsure why, read about the racial makeup of Portland and compare it to San Diego or pretty much anywhere in Southern California. Story 44. I lived in the rural Midwest for a year. As a Northeasterner, it was strange. Everybody is super nice. They all go to church, even ones who say they aren't religious. They're extraordinarily friendly, and they talk about roads and cardinal directions because the whole state is basically a grid. I had at least a couple taxi driver moments where a stranger would start a conversation and I'd sound like a city-dwelling dago when I answered, confused, you talking to me? They were just being nice and it was genuine and it startled the out of me. Loved it out there, great people, but they were different. Story 45. I feel like I observed other people having culture shock while dealing with tourists. I worked in the gift shop of a small museum that was in a region that got a lot of tourists from NYC. Somehow the look on their face when I told them the closest place to get something to eat was a 20 to 30 minute drive away. Unless it's a Sunday, then nothing will really be open seemed to say a lot to me. Oh, and your cell phone won't work here either. It's a dead spot. Story 46. I was watching the BuzzFeed dirtball video, and I was shocked at how far they had to travel for a little bit of dirt. I've lived in the South all my life, and the thought of no dirt makes me shudder. Story 47. I'm from New Jersey. In Florida, I saw two teenagers sitting in the back of an open pickup truck on the highway with huge Confederate flags on the truck. You wouldn't get away with that for 10 seconds here. Also, when I traveled to Alabama, there was a huge sign on the local theater that said no firearms allowed on the premises. I didn't realize people needed to strap up before going to see a film with a family. Story 48. I moved out to Indiana for a few years after living on the East Coast. I remember driving into the state through Ohio and there being this massive cross that visible from a highway. I even went to school in the Midwest and didn't really see the religious fervor until I got to Indiana. I prefer the godless Northeast to that any day. Story 49. I'm an American, and I actually grew up all over the world. I never experienced culture shock as a kid. I did experience it when I moved from Colorado to Indiana during the last presidential election. It was surreal how different it was. Beforehand, it was pretty normal for Republicans and Democrats or whatever to be open and civil in conversations. In Indiana, I had to be really quiet about my beliefs, and if someone found out, they would find ways to bring it up and be petty about it. Not outright mean, but bordering it. I worked at the county in the courthouse. The way women were viewed was also really shocking. I was and am unmarried, and I was one of the only ones near my age that wasn't married. My boss asked when I was getting married on my first day. I've had friends who I thought were really well-rounded people absolutely freak out when they moved next door to people from the Middle East. Obviously, it isn't everyone, and it isn't a bad place at all, but it's very different, and I felt very disconnected and out of place for a while. I miss how open Colorado was. Story 50. The first time I walked into a super Walmart, I thought this is what it must feel like to be in Texas. Also, the speed of life far outside the city can be super slow. My usual Dunkin' order takes the 1 or 2 people behind the counter 2 minutes to make. I was in the middle of nowhere and ordered the same thing, and it took 20 minutes. Story 51. Yes, currently still ongoing, somewhat. I was raised overseas UK, so I left the States age 10 and didn't return until I was 31. The 3 years I've been home has been one long culture shock, reacclimating to being back in the homeland as an adult. I'm put in mind of Jules and Vincent's talk at the beginning of Pulp Fiction, where Vincent talks about all the little things instead of there being one singular difference. Story 52. Spent most of my life in Arkansas, and I moved to Wisconsin for a year last year. Those accents throw me off, and so did the looks when I asked for sweet tea. Oh, you betcha. Story 53. Yes, I live in WV and don't leave the state too much, but whenever I do I get shocked by how rude people are. In my town everyone is surprisingly nice, always holding doors for each other, having friendly conversations with strangers, and the only people that make me nervous are the addicts. But in other states people are so rude, even just a few hours into another state the differences are obvious. It's so strange. Story 54. As a native Wisconsinite, my biggest culture shock was going to a Waffle House in Tennessee. The workers there barely moved. They were so friendly, spent so much time chatting but spent so little time working, and everyone seemed fine with the fact that they'd been there an hour and were just getting their eggs and toast. The whole South was like that. No one seemed to have any urgency for anything, and they were all so friendly all the time. I get a bit of flack because I'm a little more outgoing than most Midwesterners, but they put me to shame. Indianapolis was a culture shock in that it was like an entire city decided to be Applebee's. All the restaurants were chains, all the hotels were chains, all the bars were chains, everything was boring. The West Coast was sort of in between the Deep South and the Midwest in a lot of ways. People weren't super outgoing with me, and they didn't move with the sense of purpose I'm used to seeing people move, but workers at least seemed attentive and efficient. Hawaii is basically another culture entirely, as is Puerto Rico. Story 55. Went to the US side of Niagara Falls. Canadian side is way better, and it seemed like we were the only white English-speaking people there, mostly tourists from East Asia and India. Chances are they were bilingual, but walking around they were speaking their native language. It was interesting to be a minority, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Didn't feel threatened or anything, but coming from a small, predominantly white literally 98 county it was a new experience. which I welcome. I wish I could meet more people from different places. Story 56 moved from Oklahoma to Connecticut. I've lived in a lot of countries prior to this, and by far moving to New England was the most extreme culture shock I ever experienced. Story 57 Yes, I went to Florida once. None of the grocery stores had summer sausage and none of the restaurants had tenderloin sandwiches, but the South does have this amazing beverage called cheerwine, and that was pretty good. Story 58 When I visited southern Illinois once, in the Northeast, we have lots of little bird sparrows, starlings, blue jays, pigeons, etc., with the occasional big geese, seagulls, ducks. I remember staring at the sky once and feeling really uncomfortable once, before I realized that I didn't see any flocks of birds, or geese or seagulls. There were just no birds. Story 59 In college in Southern California, having peers criticize the way I dressed to my face was quite the surprise. Turns out, it was unacceptable to some people that I had a preference to get affordable and comfortable clothes. That bullshit was over after middle school in rural Washington. Story 60 from the Northeast, which is relatively urban and focuses on education, a remainder of our Puritan days. I think the first few times I went to the South I was shocked by nobody was fit. The North has some large people and some people who are overweight but they're considered normal, but nobody was even regular sized in some areas I went to in Atlanta. The focus was more on looks. I remember going to a brewery and my friend was the only one there with short brown hair. Everyone else had long hair and they were 90 blonde. They really dressed up for this brewery too. In the North it's not uncommon for women to wear athleisure clothes out in public. In Florida they don't walk places. They don't walk. I tried to walk a mile to work and the sidewalk just stopped. It turned into a highway. No indication given that this would happen. People drove by and beeped as though I was stranded and helpless while I was walking. The restaurants had huge parking lots. I walked half a mile to Publix and there wasn't a consistent sidewalk or streetlights. Crazy. Story 61 Grew up in the South. Went to college in Denver. Moved to Seattle after. And now I'm back in Georgia and moving to NYC in a few months to be with my husband. So yeah, those are all major culture shocks.